In 2050, collapse may not start with a missile. It may start with a faucet. You turn it on, nothing comes out. Then the damage spreads beyond the tap. Food prices climb, cities ration what's left, and people move by the millions towards places that still have enough. This video follows the water crisis to 2050. Which regions are most exposed? Which countries gain power while others start losing control? And which ones could break first when there's simply not enough left to go around? The scariest part is how ordinary it looks at first. The buildings are still standing, the lights still come on, but the water is already arriving by truck. This isn't some distant theory. UNICEF says 4 billion people already face severe water scarcity for at least 1 month every year. And by 2030, intense water scarcity could displace 700 million people. At that scale, the question changes fast. It's not just how much water does this city have, it's who gets access first. And once a city has to choose, the crisis stops being abstract. Hospitals feel it, families feel it, and food is next. Inside the city, the crisis doesn't hit everyone at once. It moves building by building, tank by tank, block by block. At home, water becomes a calculation. What do you use now? What do you save? And what has to wait? Then it reaches the places that can't afford to slow down. Hospitals, nursing homes, cooling systems, the parts of a city people almost never think about. Behind the scenes, officials start making choices no one wants to make. Which neighborhoods keep water pressure and which ones lose it first? Soon, water stops being something that simply arrives. It becomes something people stand in line for, carry home, and protect. And that's when the next problem shows up. Because when a city runs short on water, food is never far behind. Food is where the water crisis gets harder to ignore. Because before a city runs out of meals, a field usually runs out of water. Most people never see the water they use. It's embedded in the wheat, the rice, the corn, in almost everything that ends up on a plate. So when a farming region dries out, the shock doesn't stay there. It moves through ports, ships, markets, and prices until it lands somewhere far from the drought. That's when the crisis reaches people who may still have water at home. The top works, but the grocery bill starts climbing. And once food gets tight, governments start thinking differently. Exports become political, reserves become strategic, and food imports become a vulnerability no one wants to admit. The UN University warns that around 3 billion people and more than half of global food production sit in regions where water storage is already shrinking or unstable. So the next question isn't just who runs out of water, it's which parts of the world start to fracture first when water starts pulling food down with it. This crisis won't hit the map evenly. Some regions are already closer to the edge, hotter, drier, and with far less room for error. And the trend is accelerating. WRI warns that by 2050, 1 billion more people could be living under extremely high water stress. The Middle East and North Africa are already near the limit, rainfall declining, heat rising, and millions living with almost no buffer left. South Asia faces a different kind of pressure. Massive populations, intensive farming, and water systems already pushed close to the limit. But the shock doesn't stay inside those regions. It moves into food, energy, trade, and pressure on places that still think they're safe. And wealth doesn't make anyone immune. A city can look modern and fully alive, while its water reserves quietly fall underneath it. But the most dangerous places aren't always the driest ones. They're often the ones that look stable, until one bad season pushes the system over the edge. But surface water is only half the story. The next crisis is harder to see, harder to measure, and already disappearing underground. The dangerous part is that groundwater doesn't vanish in front of you. It disappears quietly, under farms, under cities, under everything built above it. For years, it can feel like a solution. Dig deeper, pump harder, keep things running one more season. But groundwater isn't an endless backup plan. When too much is removed, the land above it can start to sink. So the response becomes a trap. Each dry well leads to a deeper one until the future gets drained before it arrives. And the damage doesn't stay underground. Roads crack, pipes shift, foundations shift in ways they were never meant to. Then comes the human part. When land can no longer support farms, people don't just lose water, they start moving. When people start moving, the water crisis stops being environmental. It becomes human, it becomes political, and pressure starts moving with them. The destination doesn't escape the crisis, it inherits it. More people, more demand, more strain on systems already stretched thin. Then the waiting begins, for housing, for work, for aid, and every line becomes a political problem no one planned for. But pressure doesn't only move with people, it moves through rivers, dams, and borders, drawn around water that nations still have to share. That's when a drought stops being just a weather event. It becomes leverage, a border dispute, a reason for governments to harden. And once water reaches that level, the question shifts again. Not just who is running out, but who gains power when everyone else starts needing more. In a thirsty world, power doesn't only belong to countries with water, it belongs to countries that know how to control it. But control takes investment, desalination, recycling, treatment infrastructure, systems that can save a city as long as they keep running. Food becomes part of that leverage. A country that keeps growing and exporting gains influence over countries that can't produce enough on their own. And that's when water enters the negotiation room. Technology transfers, food contracts, infrastructure deals, all built around one question: what do you need and what are you willing to give for it? The winners of 2050 may not be the most naturally advantaged. They may simply be the ones that moved early, before water redrew the world around them. By 2050, this may not look like one global collapse. It may look like systems still running, but slower, tighter, and under constant pressure. Some cities will keep moving, but normal life starts to feel different. Food costs more, services slow, and trust in the system gets thinner. That's where the water crisis becomes personal, not in speeches or reports, at the table, inside the home, where the pressure lands first. By 2050, the map will have shifted. Some places will have adapted, others won't have had the chance. And the real question is, how much time do we think we still have?